Last word briefly to you, Stan Orme, because you were at the beginning. The same question really that I put to both Mr. Walker and also to Dr. Owen. If public opinion continues to be hostile to nuclear energy, will that influence your view, or do you have to lead public opinion, not be guided by it?
Well, obviously you take account of public opinion, but I believe that this is such an important issue. You've got to stand up and say what you believe is right. We'd already done that prior to the last election, and it's only re-emphasised our basic policy, which must be towards coal-fired stations.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much. And I'm now going down to the audience who've been listening patiently during this part of the programme. You heard there several things from abroad about the pros and the cons of nuclear power, safety versus the economics of it. You've also heard politicians saying, in effect, there may be a deep amount of public concern at the moment, but we should make cautious, considered judgments, not in the heat of that moment. Is there anyone who dissents from that view expressed? Yes.
Well, I live in Cumbria, near Winscow, and I've lived with the nuclear industry all my life. And from uranium mining right through to final waste disposal, the nuclear power programme presents unacceptable risks, not only to this generation, but to thousands of people and many generations to come. And I think we've got to stop the nuclear power programme now.
Wait, yes, in the middle here.
I lived in Pennsylvania during the 3 Mile Island accident, and what disturbs me is we're now hearing the same sort of blithe reassurances we got in Pennsylvania back then. And I'm very disturbed at the possibility of a Chernobyl in Britain, because if there is one here, being a densely populated country and a very small country, Britain's not going to get a second chance.
I'd like to hear, if I could, from someone who feels that, given that there is anxiety about Chernobyl, nonetheless, a pause for consideration, no instant decisions, is the right approach. There must be, I suspect, someone here who feels that. Yes, at the back there. You spoke at the beginning of the programme.
I think that's the right approach. I think all you can do at the moment is pause. I'm basically not the slightest bit interested in the British nuclear industry. I'll vote for whoever can give me the first constructive list of things to do to protect my child from the one that comes from Cherbourg.
Right, and not any other views here. Yes, right in the middle here, with the sweater on.
I think that what that lady said earlier in the programme is right about the unknown. And it's very clear from the statistics of the risk assessment that none of these accidents ought to have happened. We're talking 1 in 10,000 years, 1 in 100,000 years, 1 in 1,000,000 years. It's very clear that we just don't understand what can possibly go wrong. And I don't think that we ought to take risks that we cannot quantify.
Over here, you had your, in the pink, maybe the wrong colour, pink sweater anyway.
Yes, I'd just like to make the point that the MOD is actually subsidising our nuclear industry, and that the plutonium-239, which is manufactured in a nuclear reactor, is necessary for nuclear warheads. And could the Trident missile programme actually go ahead without a vast expansion of our nuclear industry?
Is there anyone from here who works inside the industry? Some of our sizable contingent there might have something to say about this.
I think one point that we ought to make is that some of us in this country already live quite close to pressurised water reactors. Some of the French pressurised water reactors are very close to the coast, and our south coast towns also very, very close. The other point we should make is that we are already enjoying some of the benefits of cheap electricity from pressurised water reactors across the Channel cable.
And you are convinced that the risk is so remote that even if it exists, it should not affect people's lives?
I'm convinced that the risk can be contained to within a reasonable, how shall I put it, safety. The Nuclear Inspectorate, I trust them.
The last brief word down here in the front, lady in blue.
Yeah, we were told on paper that this accident in Russia should never happen. It was not supposed to happen, and it did. And I feel that is absolutely what will happen in this country eventually, before long.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you in the audience, especially those I'm sorry I couldn't bring in. Thank you to everyone who spoke to us across satellites and in the studio here. That's all, though, for this programme. Of course, we haven't managed to raise all the questions that we should have done. What we've tried to do is to raise the right issues about a disaster which will surely reverberate here and abroad for a very long time yet. So from First Tuesday, good night.
One of the West's top nuclear experts has visited the Chernobyl disaster site and says the destroyed reactor is still smoking. Dr. Hans Blix, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, was interviewed tonight on Soviet television. The news program reported at length on the disaster, with the Soviets acknowledging for the first time that the fire isn't out. Today, a group of Western journalists were flown to Kiev. They were told people within an 18-mile radius of the plant weren't evacuated until May the 2nd. That's a week after the explosion. Earlier, the common market banned imports of meat from the communist bloc. A fruit and vegetable ban is expected to take force on Saturday. In Britain, levels of radioactivity were tonight said to have fallen, but they have been high enough to set off alarms at Sellafield.
The clearest details of the disaster so far have emerged today, 13 days after the accident which crippled the Chornobyl power station. Yugoslavia's news agency reported a third person had died in a Kiev hospital as a direct result of the accident. 10 of the most seriously ill have had bone marrow transplants. In several cases, the donors were the patient's own children. And 200 injured people have been transferred to Moscow hospitals. The Soviet government promised compensation to the injured and full pay to those unable to work. At the plant, thousands are now said to be working on clean-up operations. The evening paper Izvestia reported from Kiev that children weren't allowed to play out of doors, that open-air food stalls had been banned from the streets, and that passengers were being checked for radiation at bus and railway stations. Ian Glover-James reports.
The Soviet newsreader on tonight's main bulletin spent more than 6 minutes reading reports from today's Politburo meeting concerning industrial and economic performance. It was as if the world's worst civilian nuclear disaster had never happened. And then a decision by the Council of Ministers that flies in the face of what the Russians have maintained so far. There would be compensation for the Chernobyl victims. The payment of damages to evacuees involved in helping eliminate the consequences of the incident. A one-off payment made available for evacuees' clothing and for other basic necessities, food and travel. Then a flat-rate disability benefit available for those injured by the accident. And finally, free holidays and health treatment for those who need it. Tonight's announcement is a complete contrast to what the Soviets have said to date. Only 2 days ago in West Germany, Soviet spokesman Boris Yeltsin dismissed any notion of compensation for Chernobyl victims. Then the Soviets showed the first independent expert who's been to the site. The United Nations nuclear team, led by Dr. Hans Blix, a Swedish scientist, flew over the reactor.
Well, we have seen the site from the air, and we have seen that a little smoke is still coming up from the damaged plant. We have also seen that there is a lot of activity to contain the reactor and to maintain it under control. And we have also been informed by the competent persons about this work.
Нам также компетентные лица рассказали о выполняемой работе.
Что вы можете сказать по поводу интенсивности работы?
So what can you say about the intensity of these works which are carried out?
Well, they have evidently had a very heavy work in the past 2 weeks.
Очевидно, что в течение последних 2 недель была проделана очень большая работа.
And been successful.
И она была успешной, эта работа.
And we hope that they will continue to stabilize the situation.
Later, the first Western reporters to be allowed anywhere near the region. This group traveled from Moscow to a press conference in Kiev, 60 miles south of Chernobyl. They reported a heavy police presence in Kiev. Police conducting spot radiation checks, water trucks washing down the streets, and their report spoke of a city swept by rumors after the nuclear reactor had exploded.
So it's still not really clear what's happening inside the stricken reactor. Soviet reports speak of heroism, but give few details. Helicopters have flown over the burning core, dropping sand, lead and boron on it. But some German scientists now think the core may actually have turned into a melt-through, burning through the concrete floor in what's popularly known as the China syndrome. One Soviet official has asked for the Germans' advice.
This time he wanted to know how to prevent a hot molten mass, that's the way he described it, from melting through the concrete foundations of the reactor building.
One expert tonight predicted an apocalyptic vision of what might happen.
I doubt very much that the water supply cooling the fuel is in any way still effective, and as a result, the radioactivity in the fuel will be increasing its temperature steadily, so much so that it may already have begun to melt, and if it hasn't already begun to melt, it may soon begin to melt. And once it begins to melt and collapses together, it will then be impossible to cool because you will not then have any channels through it. And at the temperature that it is likely to reach, it will melt the containing steel and concrete. It may subside right through the floor of the reactor, through the foundations of the nuclear plant, right into the subsoil, at which point it may contact groundwater. There may be steam explosions that will open pathways back to the surface. There might even be conceivably hydrogen explosions. There will certainly be massive contamination of the local waterways.
If a melt-through has occurred, then it is possible that the radiation could spread through the earth to contaminate the river Dnieper, which gives water to the whole Ukraine. And the Chornobyl plant is dangerously near the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. A melt-through would endanger its water supply. The Ukraine is the granary of the Soviet Union. It grows wheat, potatoes, sugar beet and barley. Its herds provide meat and dairy produce. Already the authorities are checking all sorts of agricultural produce for traces of radiation. The consequences could be dire.
There's no doubt it's a severe blow to Soviet agriculture because the Ukraine, the southern Ukraine, is the Soviet Union's breadbasket. It grows a substantial proportion of their wheat and of their sugar. And it's going to have to buy some grains and sugar on the world market. Whether it turns to the EC or whether it goes to the US or Argentina remains to be seen. I think they'll be going to almost all those parties through traders.
There are reports, denied by the Commission, that the Soviet Union is already approaching the common market for new food stocks. If it turned out to be true, then the breadbasket of Russia might just be replenished from the groaning warehouses of the EEC at a handsome subsidy.
Here, the alarm system at the Sellafield nuclear reprocessing plant has gone off several times because of radiation in rainwater. The levels have been up to 10 times the normal figure.
The Energy Secretary made his first trip to the nuclear plant at Sellafield in Cumbria today at a time when public anxiety about the industry is running at its highest yet. Sellafield has been something of a black spot for that industry in public relations terms, with a reputation swollen by a series of well-publicised accidents. Mr. Walker is determined to change that image. He expressed complete confidence in the new team of managers at the plant. The emphasis is now on the positive side of the industry, the cheap power, the jobs and bulging export orders. Public confidence in things nuclear, though, has taken a severe dent since the Chornobyl disaster. But Mr. Walker said safety in Britain was of the highest possible quality, and he talked of making it a much more open industry.
The government says levels of radioactivity over Britain from the Chornobyl disaster are continuing to fall. Milk, tap water and vegetables are all said to be safe. In the Soviet Union, Western journalists have been taken to see people evacuated from Chernobyl who are now undergoing medical tests. Brian Hanrahan reports.
Radiation screening was actively underway when the press party reached a village housing several thousand evacuees. First, they're checked with a Geiger counter, and if that looks too large, then the journalists were told blood samples are taken for analysis. In this village, according to the medical workers, 3 out of 1,000 had so far been found to have excessive body radiation. All the people here had come from the edge of the evacuation zone, about 20 miles from the reactor, and had been moved last Friday. The Reuters news agency correspondent, who was with the party, said they seemed to understand the long-term radiation dangers.
Talking to people, though, they are aware that some of the symptoms may appear a long time after the event.
Did they seem concerned by that?
Some of them did. We talked, for instance, to an 18-year-old girl who had been evacuated from close to the disaster itself. We asked her, for instance, what she thought the implications would be for her children, and she said, I know there could be problems, but there's nothing I can do about it.
And another week of worry for much of the world over the Soviet nuclear disaster at Chernobyl. On the continent, some countries refused to allow the import of food from Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the Russians started giving the first details of radiation levels around the area. Here at home, the government said there was no danger to British people from the accident. It was only this week that the first people from the disaster area were evacuated to Moscow. They were mostly young children. Television pictures show life in Kiev proceeding as normal, but the authorities have warned children not to go outdoors. Water was sprayed on the streets in an attempt to keep radiation levels down. The immediate area surrounding the plant was evacuated, but it's not clear how soon this was done. Farming in the Ukraine continued, but radio and television stations advised people to stay indoors and to wash vegetables. The Soviet Ministry of Agriculture denied that there was any danger to health. It said radiation was within accepted limits. At a news conference in Moscow, the local authorities at Chernobyl were blamed for not revealing the full extent of the disaster.
Сегодня на этой пресс-конференции в дополнение
лишь бушующие пожары, тысячи жертв, полное уничтожение станций.
The first instinct of the Soviet system, if anything goes fundamentally wrong, is to try to conceal it. That was the first instinct. They do not like any reflection on the Marxist society. They say it's a perfect society, therefore if anything goes wrong, they try to hide it.
The nuclear cloud from Chernobyl arrived over Britain, and extra radiation from it was detected in rainwater. Abnormal levels of radiation were also found in milk supplies. But again, the message from the government was that there was no danger. The government set up an incident room at the Ministry of Agriculture to track the radioactive cloud. It also took calls from worried members of the public.
So radioactive iodine, there's none in milk normally. So
I think at the moment not to drink any fresh rainwater is a good thing, because the risk is very small, but if you can avoid a small risk, why not avoid it? For the majority of the rest of the people in the country, they should not be worried. I know they'll be concerned, and that's why we're here. We're monitoring all the time. We want to give as much information as possible to people. They need not be worried at the moment. We're continuing to watch the situation.
The Energy Secretary, Peter Walker, inspected the nuclear reprocessing plant at Sellafield in Cumbria. The visit had been planned before the disaster at Chernobyl, but it was a timely opportunity for the government to reassure the public about the safety of nuclear power.
Takes out the cesium and strontium.
Safety standards at Sellafield were stepped up recently after a series of well-publicized accidents.
Unload the highly radioactive fuel from the heavily shielded plant.
The European community tonight finally agreed to suspend imports of fresh food from Eastern Europe. In Britain, the government said levels of radioactivity from the Chornobyl disaster were continuing to fall, and rainwater, milk and vegetables were now all safe. The Soviet news agency Novosti reported that the death toll from the disaster had risen to 4. Western journalists have been to see people evacuated from Chernobyl. Brian Hanrahan reports.
Radiation screening was actively underway when the press party reached a village housing several thousand evacuees. First, they're checked with a Geiger counter, and if that looks too large, then the journalists were told blood samples are taken for analysis. In this village, according to the medical workers, 3 out of 1,000 had so far been found to have excessive body radiation. All the people here had come from the edge of the evacuation zone, about 20 miles from the reactor, and had been moved last Friday.
We talked, for instance, to an 18-year-old girl who had been evacuated from close to the disaster itself. We asked her, for instance, what she thought the implications would be for her children, and she said, I know there could be problems, but there's nothing I can do about it.
In Kiev itself, they found every sign that normal life was continuing, but found it difficult to get a sense of popular feeling. Warnings had been given, and what appeared to be a well-organized program of tests were going on to check the radiation levels in milk and water, although some of the equipment appeared old-fashioned. The authorities say that all their measurements so far indicate that the water is safe. The correspondents were brought to Kiev to quell the more alarmist rumors about what might be happening there. But with only 24 hours and a tightly controlled itinerary, they're cautious about offering conclusions about anything apart from what they'd seen themselves. This is Brian Hanrahan in Moscow for BBC News.
It's reported that 13 people have now died as a result of the Chernobyl nuclear accident. The American doctor, Robert Gale, said Soviet doctors were concerned about the long-term effects. He said 100,000 people would need monitoring for radiation for the rest of their lives. Soviet scientists admit that a catastrophic meltdown nearly occurred at Chernobyl. They say fuel in the reactor was white hot. The tons of sand and lead dropped onto the reactor could have pushed it down into a pool of water below. No one knows what would have happened then. Soviet television showed these pictures of how the helicopters dropped bags of sand onto the reactor. The bags were lashed together and then dangled from a rope 250 yards long. The area around Chernobyl was evacuated. 90,000 people were moved out. But there were long delays and most were exposed to radiation for a week or more. Authorities say people will be allowed back, but even the most optimistic say it'll be months before the area is safe. In Moscow, the American millionaire Armand Hammer arrived on a mercy mission. Dr. Hammer, a friend of the late President Brezhnev, brought some vital medical supplies. They are needed for bone marrow operations carried out on radiation sufferers. In West Germany, thousands took part in protests over the Chernobyl accident. There's much concern among West Germans about nuclear power, and it's even been suggested that the issue might lose Chancellor Kohl the next election. In London, CND supporters lobbied Parliament as a debate got underway in the Commons. They fear that a nuclear accident like the one at Chernobyl could happen here. Mr. Mr. Gorbachev said the Chernobyl accident pointed up the dangers of nuclear technology. It was his first public comment on the disaster, and he said the worst was now over. He said it showed the abyss that would open up if nuclear war were ever to break out. He announced an extension to the Soviet test ban and called for new talks with Mr. Reagan.
Я подтверждаю свое предложение президенту Рейгану встретиться безотлагательно в столице любого европейского государства, которое будет готово нас принять, или, скажем, в Хиросиме, и договориться о запрете ядерных испытаний.
Later, Mr. Gorbachev honored Dr. Robert Gale at the Kremlin. He's the American bone marrow specialist who's been treating some of the radiation victims. Dr. Gale has given transplants to 19 victims. Another 16, including some who died, were so badly ill that a transplant wasn't thought to be of any use. An accident at Hinkley Point power station last November was caused by a single faulty bolt. The official report said tons of radioactive gas leaked out, but there was no danger to the public. The leak at Hinkley Point caused a major alert. 500 of the power station workers were immediately evacuated. The Electricity Generating Board said the accident was not like Chernobyl. It was caused by a badly fitted bolt which made a hole through which radioactive cooling gas escaped. The Northern Ireland Secretary